The R5-1400 is a very good CPU. It's so good, in fact, that it should be reshaping the second-hand market to make every Intel processor of comparable performance in years past completely irrelevant and knock down the prices. But thanks to that shiny Intel sheen that comes from being market dominant over the last half-decade or more, it's really kinda not. Let's discuss by taking a close look at secondhand CPU prices in relation to the performance that the R5-1400 will give us. Okay, so before we get into the pricing, I have to talk about motherboards. If you're going to buy a secondhand CPU, you gotta have a motherboard to go with it. That's obvious. As I have said in the past on this channel, and it is a point I want to keep stressing because it is critically important for anyone looking to buy secondhand goods, motherboards die faster than CPUs. Anywhere from 2 to 5 years, sometimes barely within warranty period, but often well out of it, and then you're kind of fucked. This is precisely the reason the market right now is flooded full of Sandy and Ivy Bridge locked i5s. It's because there's no motherboards to use them in that are left that are working. Also, you have to consider the fact that there are a world of people out there with high-end desktop chips on a given socket that want to get more life out of them and don't want to spend $300-400 to upgrade altogether. So they look for a second-hand usable motherboard that supports that CPU and in some cases overclocking to try and give it some more legs. So ultimately what this results in is a serious supply shortage, and the price of the motherboards, while they don't go up over what they were at retail, they have a tendency to retain their value and stay relatively close to where they were when they were first released. And with regards to motherboard lifespans, it is of course critically important to remember that they do die, and if you buy a second-hand one, the odds of it dying on you are going to be greatly increased over one that was bought new and was confirmed to be working out of the box. Anyhow, enough of the preamble, let's go over some numbers. The R5-1400 is a 4-core 8-thread CPU based on the Ryzen architecture that is overclockable, and when paired with a B350 motherboard that has a reasonable VRM design and has relatively all the features you would need for a mid-range gaming system, comes to about $320 Canadian before taxes. So generally, when evaluating CPU and motherboard combos against the industry standard, what I like to do is take 10% off for every year that has passed since the target item has been released. So then with that math in mind, let's go through the years and see if we can find a comparable deal. Now, if you're looking at Skylake and you want to roughly match the performance that the R5-1400 gives you, you pretty much have to target something like a locked i5. i5-6500 is probably the best fit and is going to be the most widely available because there were lots of them in pre-builts that got torn down. Can you obtain an i5-6500 with a working motherboard for about $280 or $290 here in Canada? The answer is yes, and I have personally done a little bit better than that, in fact. I have a guy who sells OEM tray i5-6500 pretty much on a regular, consistent basis for about $200 even, and you couple that with an H110 motherboard that you can buy at retail for $60 and you're looking pretty good. Now, of course, there are pros and cons to going with the Skylake CPU over top of the brand shiny new Ryzen 5. The pro is that it requires no overclocking. The motherboard is actually considerably cheaper than a B350 motherboard, so there's that. But on the downside, of course, thread count is going to be important, especially in gaming going forward into the future as developers utilize more of those resources that are going to become available with CPUs of the future. So that quad core without hyperthreading might hold you back a bit in the long term. So it's not exactly a direct comparison. But here in 2017 for today's games, it's certainly a fair purchase. And being that we're about 20 or 30 bucks under what I would consider to be my acceptable threshold, I'm going to give this one a thumbs up. I kind of got away with putting Skylake in 2016 because it was still the widely available architecture before Kaby Lake came out in the early part of that year. So today is June, so if you're looking at June of 2016, it was roughly still Skylake, I guess, but I can't really do that kind of cheating with Broadwell. Broadwell was definitely released by this time in 2015, so it would have been the CPU of choice of that year. And unfortunately, nobody actually bought it, so there is no secondhand market for it. So moving on. those not aware, Haswell Refresh was pretty much the Skylake of 2014. It was the same as Haswell, except they replaced the TIM with something better, apparently, under the hood, and they upped the clock speeds just a little bit. Now, interestingly enough, 9 series chipset motherboards are actually still available at retail, albeit in diminishing supply. You can still get a Z97 board brand new from the store for about 90 bucks if you're willing to settle for something plain and simple. So in theory then, all we would need is to find somebody willing to sell us an i5 4690K for roughly $140 to $150, which doesn't seem that unreasonable, right? Wrong. You would be luckier than a pig in shit. Wait a minute. Pigs and shit aren't lucky. You would be luckier than a leprechaun with a horseshoe up his ass if you found somebody willing to sell you a Haswell i5 that was unlocked for any less than about 160 or 170 bucks. And in fact, many of them still go for about 200 because people are fucking retarded. The fact that motherboards are still widely available for the socket are sort of what's keeping CPU prices in this category propped up. Now, you can get comparable performance to something like an R5 1400 with one of the high-end locked i5s of that generation. So a 4670 or 4690 without the K with multi-core turbo enable gets you close enough. And that might be doable, but the problem is those chips were very rare. You see, people who build i5 systems are sort of broken into 3 categories. You got people who get the absolute lowest end chip, like the 4460 or the 6400 or whatnot. And then you got people at the high end who get the unlocked K-SKU CPUs. And then you've got the people that fall directly in the middle, and it doesn't make any sense for any 3 of those categories to buy a 4690 or a 4670. So nobody bought it. The Haswell generation's popular mid-range i5 was the 4590, and it doesn't quite get you there, and you're really sacrificing a fair bit, including those 4 extra threads if you happen to buy one. So I wouldn't quite value it in the same performance class as the R5 1400, especially going forward. So I think for this category, we're gonna have to go with a marginal thumbs down. For this section, all you have to do is take my last section, play it again, but add a couple of points. Number 1, because these CPUs started with a fucking 4 and there was no differentiation between the 2 of them aside from the last 2 digits of their goddamn number, people perceive them as all being a part of the same thing when technically they're not, although practically they kind of are. So because of that, despite the fact that these are a year older, nobody really fucking consciously knows that, and it's reflected in the prices. So you're not going to save more than about 10 bucks going with a 4670K over a 4690K, and given that my formula exacerbates this problem even more, the Haswell non-refresh section also gets a thumbs down. And next we're on to Ivy Bridge, which was released about 5 years ago, more or less. This is where the math starts to get real murky, because you're talking about what needs to be a $160 price point, in my opinion, to meet the performance level and justify the reduction in cost in exchange for absorbing all that age. Now, I have purchased 3570Ks in the recent past for about $120, $130. So if you get lucky and find a combo for about $160, you would obviously be in pretty good shape by my estimation, but that's not typical and it's not common. Going from just local searches that I found on eBay, including shipping, which is important to note, or local listings on Kijiji that, of course, are pickup only, I can't seem to find one that's going for any less than $140, and I could maybe talk them down to $120, but I still wouldn't have a motherboard. Being that these CPUs need to be overclocked to be competitive with what's on the market today, you're going to have to buy a cooler along with that motherboard and that CPU to make it all work. It's just not worth it. 5 years is a long goddamn time for a motherboard to work, and it's at the limit of what I would consider to be usable and acceptable for someone who's looking to put together a gaming rig of that quality. Spending $200-ish on a CPU and motherboard for something that presumably would like to last you for a few years is a questionable feat indeed, when you're talking about something that's already got 5 years of life under its belt. Also, just another note, I've charted out a lot of the prices in the past of CPUs, and there's always been a little bump at Ivy Bridge, and I have no idea why. Haswell I get. Haswell has readily available retail motherboards that would make the CPUs more expensive, at least in theory. And on the flip side, we've got Sandy Bridge, which we'll talk about in more detail next, are considerably cheaper, despite the fact that they don't really perform all that much worse, use the same motherboards, same memory, all that business. But for some reason, they're a fair chunk cheaper than Ivy Bridge. I just don't get it. Maybe it's a perception thing, the fact that it's the newer chip on the socket, I don't know. Bottom line is, in terms of pricing, in my experience, in my neck of the woods, Ivy Bridge is shit, avoid it. And last, we have everyone's favorite architectural beach, Sandy Bridge. Now, Sandy Bridge i5 2500Ks are actually really cheap. You can get them for as little as $70 a piece. But again, that motherboard is a fixed cost at a minimum of about $60-70 if you want something that's overclockable. Also, the R5 1400 competes very favorably versus the 2500K, even when overclocked to upwards of 4.7, 4.8 gigahertz. And you really need those extra threads of the 2600K to get a fair comparison. When you factor in the i7, it gets to be upwards of $110, maybe even $120, plus that minimum $60 board, and you're a fair bit over my threshold. Not by a ton, but enough to be considered. So as a person who regularly puts together secondhand PCs, you kind of see my problem. In addition to that Intel sheen I was referring to, where people have this perception that Intel is better than AMD, and therefore the chips tend to retain their value, and the same way that NVIDIA graphics cards do over AMD cards, there's also this problem of AMD not having had anything competitive in the new market space for the last 6 years, which means that in the secondhand market space, there's also nothing competitive at all. And believe it or not, those AMD graphics cards that are comparable in performance to their NVIDIA counterparts actually do help keep NVIDIA graphics card prices on the secondhand market down just a wee bit. In negotiations, you can at least say, hey, your GTX 680 doesn't perform any better than my R9 770. Why the fuck are you charging $50 more? And you might be able to get him to take down his prices a bit. You can't do that with an Intel chip. So basically, just keep my math in mind and be aware of this when you venture out into the world looking for your own special deals. And just for the record, because I've never mentioned it, I upload regularly every Saturday at 6 p.m. It used to be 1 p.m. I switched it to 6 p.m. as of last week, simply because I want to see if I can manipulate YouTube's search algorithm thing and do better, I guess. I don't know. Also, I promised to stream upcoming soon. I might do that today. I think the girlfriend's gonna be out for most of the day. Maybe I'll stream you guys some Romance of the Three Kingdoms. We'll just hang out. Nothing special, nothing specific. I'll probably give away some stuff like I always do, so tune in. I will tweet out the time shortly after I'm done filming this last segment, editing and uploading. Anyway, guys, thanks again for watching. I'll see you soon. Versus what's on the market right now, you would... Oh, God.